It's Reform's big local election launch at last. Think a Trump rally, but with the quintessentially British twist of it being held at the Birmingham Arena.
Yes, they're expecting 10,000 people there tonight as Nigel Farage tries to seal his claim that he's going to win big at the local elections. And actually, he's on his way to being the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
But just how many votes does Reform need to win on May the 1st to make that a reality? And has the party got over that row with Rupert Lowe? We'll be speaking to another of Nigel Farage's enemies, Ben Habib, formerly of Reform, to find out whether, well, the party with all the momentum can actually be reunited on the right.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Tominey.
Well, Camilla, sadly, we're not together today. We are not quite at different ends of the country. I am down in Cornwall. I was here yesterday. Of course, a lot of you will have listened to yesterday's edition of the Daily Tea when I interviewed Kemi Badenoch at the Anthropy event. And that's a sort of gathering that's been going on for a while. It's trying to be, although this is probably quite a poor explanation, but it's sort of trying to be the Davos of the UK, although it's not just about bunches of globalists coming together. Actually, there was quite a big Conservative contingent here this week. We had Andrew Griffith, the Shadow Trade and Industry Secretary, Mark Garnier, the Shadow Economic Secretary, as well as Kemi Badenoch coming down, Dominic Johnston, the co-chairman of the Conservatives. So quite a big Conservative contingent down here. Most of the audience, to be straightforward, is very much sort of net zero, climate change, very liberal, quite progressive. But it was interesting that Kemi Badenoch came here, no representatives from Labour at all, because it is part of her move to try and shore up her two flanks. She's got two problems, hasn't she? She's got the reform problem, but also probably not maybe bigger, but certainly as big as reform is the Liberal Democrat problem. And of course, the West Country and the Southwest is Liberal Democrat territory. I've been speaking to a lot of Liberal Democrat MPs who are at Anthropy. But she came here to give a speech. She talked about a smaller market. What was interesting, though, Camilla, the room was absolutely packed. Several hundred people when she was giving a speech. Very few rounds of applause for her points about we need to bring back state spending, etc. A huge cheer when she was challenged by an audience member on why she had dropped net zero. So she's going into sort of the lion's den a bit more, which I think is probably useful for her.
Yeah, it sounds like me being on Question Time last night. You never get applause on the right, I'm afraid. You can make the most cogent points. No one ever claps you. They want to be hearing about people advocating for wealth taxes and net zero by 2025, as far as they're concerned. It's all very Greta Thunberg. The reason we're not in Birmingham, by the way, Kamal, and I'm working from home because I'm working on my column about taking on the left, actually, which should be quite good fun to finish later. The reason we're not in Birmingham is we had tasted this idea that we were going to have an interview today with Nigel Farage, but that has fallen through because of his timings. It's nothing personal. It's just the fact that they couldn't make it work for lunchtime because everything is focused on this mega event tonight. That's interesting in itself because they're making it an evening event, which is very Trump rally-esque. When I went to Pittsburgh before the US election, it all built up over the course of the afternoon with people queuing. But it was very much, let's come along with the family, let's get some food, let's go to a Trump rally as if you're going to the cinema or something in the evening. 10,000 people expected to descend on Birmingham. Very razzmatazz. You've got some insider goss on the kind of bells and whistles they're going to be applying here, Kamal.
Yeah, they say it's going to be one of the most immersive events. It's going to have lights. It's going to have thumping music. We've seen some of it. They've actually been testing this all around the country. Here in Cornwall, they had a big event in February, which I think is the pilot for what they want to try and achieve in Birmingham. Let's just hear a little bit from that event.
Now, since the last election, it would appear we're doing really rather well. Which means that the Prime Minister has decided he will open up the attack guns on reform, or perhaps more accurately, on me. He delivered a speech in Scotland just yesterday, saying that we were right-wing. Perish the thought. Didn't call us far right, which rather surprised me, but that will come in time. He said that his way was the way for people to have good, well-paid jobs. Well, it was the Conservatives that started it, but Labour that have continued. But the net zero madness is closing down factories, is closing down industry on a scale we couldn't have even believed. Today, it's the mini plant at Cowley that employs 3,500 people. Before that, it was 1,100 jobs going at Luton. And the reason is simple. The Labour and Conservative governments have said, you must buy electric cars. Do you want to buy electric cars? Thank you. There we are. Are you watching, Prime Minister?
Just as you say, Camilla, it sounds like a Trump rally. And this is the way that insurgent parties create momentum. And outside, there was a big demonstration from the left, people who don't like reform. But Nigel Farage used that. So his narrative was all around, they're trying to shut you down, i.e. the audience in front of him. And there were several hundred people at the Cornwall launch of their local election campaign, which was sort of this forerunner of what they're going to try and do or are doing in Birmingham tonight. And then he really lent in, actually, to Donald Trump. He started his speech talking about Donald Trump. And he actually got cheers from the audience. But I think there are some issues there around his closeness to the President of the United States.
I agree. We've been talking about the cut through from both the Rupert Lowe row, which, I mean, it looked as if it was concluded this week with the release of that independent KC's report saying that he had treated 2 women in his office unfairly. Rupert Lowe continues to deny those allegations, so the row rumbles on. I'm not sure whether that's reflected much on the doorstep. The thing that I think voters have been picking up on is this sense to which Nigel Farage has picked the wrong side on Ukraine and Russia, seems to be favourable to Putin, a leader he once said he admired, wasn't critical enough of Donald Trump when the US president described President Zelensky as a dictator, wasn't critical either, really, of that extraordinary spat in the Oval Office, with J.D. Vance also piling in on the UK president. We've had another event this week for Reform with the appointment of their candidate for Runcorn. That's the by-election that's going to be held in the absence of Mike Amesbury, who got a suspended sentence after punching a constituent in the face. That's a lady called Sarah Pochin, who seems to be quite liberal. I mean, much has been said on X and elsewhere about the fact that she once attended a refugees welcome event, that she's been in a number of different political parties before Reform. Is she blue? Is she red? Is she pro-trans? I asked Richard Dice about that, and he was insisting that the party hadn't gone soft. So we've got attacks on Reform from all sides, which, let's be honest, we weren't really anticipating after the general election. After the general election, this was the party with momentum. Has it still got that momentum, though, do you think, Kamal?
I think it still has. There's a tradition in political reporting of what's called the gallery lunch. The parliamentary lobby invite party leaders, significant government figures to lunch at the House of Commons. There was one yesterday, and Ethan Croft, one of our parliamentary journalists, was there. And do go onto the website and the app to read his account, where Nigel Farage was in ebullient, as he can only do really, in ebullient mood. I think what we're seeing, Camilla, is a few rattles in the engine, but the engine sort of isn't broken yet. But the art of politics is sometimes noticing those small rattles, and Nigel Farage has to take care that he keeps his coalition together, because everything in the UK is about a coalition of groups, and a protest party is about single issue. And that's always the problem for these types of parties. We had some polling done by IPSOS ahead of this event, which we can reveal on the Daily Tea now, about how people thought about Nigel Farage or who could be the next Prime Minister. And one point that Nigel Farage made at this lunch was, no one's laughing now when they talk about who could be the next PM. And 6 months ago, and certainly before the election, who was saying that? And what Ipsos found was, if voters are asked who they favoured as Prime Minister, at the top of the list is Nigel Farage on 28%. Wow. Starmer's on 27%, Ed Davey on 26%. And
What?
I want to ask you this, Camilla. Yes, Ed Davey, bungee jumping. He's on the right side on this increasing row for Labour on disability and support for carers and benefits cuts. Ed Davey really cutting through on there. Of course, he has a disabled son. He spoke so movingly about him before the election. But behind Ed Davey on 18 points, 18%, Kemi Badenoch. And what is interesting, Camilla, about the Runcorn by-election is that the Conservatives were neck and neck with Reform at the election. But we've heard nothing about the Conservatives and that by-election. They've almost like it's written off. Where do you think, Camilla, Kemi Badenoch is?
Yeah, so Kemi Badenoch is travelling the length and breadth of the country to try and talk to Conservative associations. I think, because I was in with some Tory people in the week, that they have written off Runcorn because of the fact that Reform is now the favourite. I posted on X, actually, Coral, the bookmakers, saying that they're the clear favourites to win that seat now. That's not to say, by the way, that the Tories aren't fully laser focused on the local elections too. Obviously, they've been managing expectations by saying we expect to suffer some very serious losses because we won a lot of these seats at the peak of Boris Johnson's sort of successes, really. And so they're coming from a point of an extraordinary high, and it's only going to go downwards for them. They're also talking about this dilemma, which is actually reflected in this Ipsos polling, not least with this Davey result. I can't believe that. Also, Kamal, net favourability. Davey, -3. Farage, -15. Starmer, -20. Badenoch, -22. So Davey is like the least less popular, if that makes any sense. The least unpopular of all of them.
Yes, all politicians are unpopular, and he's the least unpopular, yes.
Popular of them. But basically, I was speaking to somebody very senior in the party who was making the point, we are dealing with people, we are dealing with an electorate that didn't turn out last time because they were so angry with the shambles of the last few years of Tory rule, and actually with Boris Johnson squandering an 80-seat majority. And they are prevaricating between whether they're going to vote for the Lib Dems or Reform. And we're trying to say, come back to us. And actually, if you look at the by-elections that have taken place locally since the local election, Reform like to paint this picture like they've won all of them. No, they haven't. I believe the Tories have won about 15. I think Reform have won about 6. I think it's going to be a dangerous day, actually, for Labour, because this is the first sort of electoral test of what the country makes of the infancy of Keir Starmer's administration. That's taken a bit of a knock today as well, hasn't it, Kamal, with the resignation of Matthew Doyle, the head of communications at Downing Street. Is this yet again Morgan McSweeney, the chief of staff, taking the axe to rivals? He's the one who we think forced Sue Gray out. Matthew Doyle is now gone. What do we know about this?
I haven't caught up on the detail of that from my Cornwall hotel, sadly, but all I would say is that Matthew Doyle is a long-serving communications official in Labour throughout opposition. And was he really the person to understand modern communication in the way that Nigel Farage understands modern communication? Huge following on TikTok. I think that what Morgan McSweeney is doing, and this is via his cabinet, allies who are, I think, roughly Wes Streeting, Pat McFadden and Rachel Reeves, is we have to modernise this party. I'll be writing about some more findings from the Ipsos poll in my column into Monday's paper, which will be published over the weekend. And there's going to be some quite interesting findings there. They're going to be very worrying for Labour. The test for Reform is going to be, isn't it, on May the 1st on the local elections, and we had some polling on this. Are they going to win more councils than the Conservatives? And I think our poll suggested that the Conservatives were going to win 10 councils and Reform 8. Still an amazing result for Reform, but if they overhaul the Conservatives, that will be an amazing day for Farage. And then we just asked the question, what were the biggest positives for Farage and what are the biggest negatives for Farage? And the findings, the polling that was done for us has said that the positives for Farage are maybe the ones that we would imagine. Immigration under control. He understands traditional British values and he understands what people think. those are those three big positives for him that he should really focus on. And some people have been suggesting he hasn't been focusing on immigration enough, which is quite interesting. And then the biggest negatives, he would make the country more divided. He's too close to Donald Trump. And there's not enough talent in reform. His big problem is going to be on his leadership. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Ben Habib on this particularly.
Yes, before we bring in Ben Habib, you just reminded me of something that was part of that conversation I had with senior Tories in the week. They are very much now repositioning and focusing on digital and social media. So we had this salvo sent by Kemi Badenoch to CCHQ, Conservative Campaign Headquarters. Heads are rolling. It's not been good enough. This place has been staffed with too many wets and Liberal Democrats in disguise. We need to tear it up. We need to do things differently. We need to re-energise our activist base, and we need to do better on social media. Curiously, the one Tory that's doing brilliantly on social media is Robert Jenrick. And I think Kemi Badenoch is looking at his model, and it's a very slick operation, actually. He's doing some work with GB News, so he's got that kind of profile on actual linear telly. But he's also putting these videos together. They look very slick. They're all properly captioned. They're hard-hitting. He hits the streets of Birmingham and starts discussing why there's rubbish, outside of people's houses. It's slightly Vancian in a way. He's trying to be kind of like suited and booted conservative man of the people. Do you remember that whole shtick he had during the leadership campaign, that he wanted to have the presentation of David Cameron and the policies of Nigel Farage? But I just think it's interesting that Badenoch's team are waking up to that and realising that that's something that the whole of the Conservative Party should be doing more of. Farage is absolutely winning on TikTok, Insta, Snapchat, wherever. The Tories are nowhere, and they've really got to get that notched up a gear.
Matthew Doyle leaving as communications chief in Number 10 is a sort of probably an inside beltway type of story. Much more significant is the very negative polling that's already being published in response to Rachel Reeves's spring statement that people, and it's not so much around whether they believe in the policies or the ideology. They just think that Rachel Reeves isn't the person to do it. And she's got very, very negative personal rating problems, which have not been helped by either, of course, the budget last autumn or the spring statement. Camilla, wasn't it always a sort of truism of journalism that after a big moment when the Chancellor commands the airwaves for pretty much 24 hours, so you imagine, the big ones from Gordon Brown, George Osborne, there would be a positive bump in the polls for a period, and then maybe the public would rethink a little bit. But it would always be incredibly, it would be net positive for at least 24 hours. Rachel Reeves's problem is she's getting an immediate negative effect because people simply do not believe that the economic forecasts that she is laying out are not going to be destroyed by reality.
No, there was such negative coverage from across the newspaper industry. I mean, you had the lefties not liking the welfare cuts, you had the righties not liking any of it. I do recommend that you go and read Alistair Heath and other people's columns on the Telegraph website and beyond, because we all gave our own analysis. And then, of course, on the broadcast round the next morning, all she's asked about is her Sabrina Carpenter tickets at the O2. And such is her, bless her, slight incompetence politically, that when asked, in future, will you pay for your own tickets to concerts? She can't say yes. She's stuck in this sort of Labour speak doom loop. I mean, it's the same, to be fair, with her colleague at the Treasury, Darren Jones. Even Dan Tomlinson, who we spoke to on Wednesday, can't move away from the governmental script, even when challenged on the effect of the budget on businesses. It's slightly infuriating, and I think, Kamal, that the public is fast seeing through it.
You were sitting next to Darren Jones yesterday on Question Time, and you're right. He speaks with this tone of a bureaucrat who knows best, not a human being. He has his lines and he delivers them. Margaret Thatcher famously said, the problem with sitting in the middle of the road is you get run down in both directions. Yeah. And I think that is the problem that the Labour Party has at the moment. Are they, frankly, brave enough to do what they know is right? To be controversial, to cut back the state, to allow the private sector to flourish? Many of you write to us. Tim Pope wrote to us. Thank you, Tim, for writing in again. Many of you worry about the fact that the size of the state at 45% of our gross domestic product is simply not allowing the private sector, the free private sector, to flourish. And Rachel Reeves needs to make a decision if she is serious, and I think she genuinely is in her heart, that she wants to cut taxes and cut back the state. She needs to just make it absolutely clear that that's the point. Yes, you'll be attacked by the Nadia Whittams of this world, and she's going to have to make a choice. She can't keep trying to do both jobs because it never works.
Yeah, join the club on being attacked by the Nadia Whittams of this world.
You had a bit of that on BBC, didn't you?
A little bit of that. I've had a right old punch up with various socialists on the BBC this week. But anyway, you can read all about that in my column tomorrow. Shall we speak to somebody very straight talking? Politician in straight talking shock. We're going to be speaking to Ben Habib next about what Nigel Farage is really like. And he should know because he was in Reform, had a row with the leader and left. As they gear up for the local elections, has the Rupert Lowe saga damaged Reform beyond repair? It's certainly true to say that Nigel Farage has a habit of making enemies. We're going to speak to one now, Ben Habib, formerly of Reform. He's now left the party. He's sided with Rupert Lowe. Ben, thank you for joining us on the Daily Tea. Where are we at, do we think, with relations with Nigel Farage? Are you still speaking to him? Do you still have a relationship with him or the party?
Can I just say that he is not my enemy, and I certainly don't regard myself, he may regard me as an enemy, but I certainly do not regard him as an enemy. And the problem between myself and Nigel is not dissimilar to the problem that eventually Rupert hit, which is fundamentally two things. The first is that the party isn't structured in a way which allows the leadership to have any checks and balances on it. There's no form of democratization within the party. The party, contrary to everything Nigel and Zia Yousaf might say, still remains fundamentally in Nigel's control, and Zia has a seat at the table. Not even Richard Tice, Lee Anderson, or James McMurdoch really have a voice of any description on a governance level. So whatever Nigel gets up and decides he wants to do happens. That, for me, is a structure which is incapable of morphing from an insurgency into a party which seeks to govern. If you want to govern this country, even in good economic and other times, you need to be able to attract very high caliber people alongside you to form a front bench with. If it is just the Nigel Farage dog and pony show, you're only going to get dogs and ponies. And that's a fundamental issue. And then I think the other issue is that over the last few months, you may or may not have noticed this, Nigel Farage is steadily tacking from what I would call the colloquially right-wing ground to fairly a centrist ground, and leaving really not much choice for the electorate, because we've already got a number of parties on the centre or centre-left of British politics, and we don't need yet another party. We need a party that stands for a proud, independent, sovereign, prosperous United Kingdom, making policies for the British people and for the United Kingdom itself. And Farage seems to be pivoting away from that. So ideologically, as well as structurally, Reform, I think, is in a very difficult place.
Ben, could you just remind us what it was like working with Nigel Farage and what the fallout, if fallout it was about?
I haven't worked with Nigel Farage since the Brexit Party days. When I was deputy leader of Reform, for the vast majority of that period, Richard Tice was the leader. And actually, I had a lot of discussion with Richard Tice before I agreed to join the party. And at one point, I declined to join the party because of these structural issues and because of already the beginnings of an ideological rift between myself and Nigel, who was the major shareholder in the party. And I wrote, actually, without talking too much about what happened nitty-gritty between me and Richard, but I wrote to Richard on the 16th of March 2023, actually declining to join Reform UK for the reasons that I've just explained. And then under pressure and on a promise of a letter of comfort from him that the party would be run consensually, that we would fight for the reuniting of Northern Ireland with Great Britain, a proper Brexit, and that we'd do no deals with the Tories. When he made me that composition of promises, I agreed to join the party. And then we did pretty well. We took the party from 6% in the polls to 16% when Rishi Sunak called the election on the 22nd of May, 2024. And then Nigel came back, appointed himself leader on the 3rd of June. I had had no discussions with Nigel at all about the possibility of him coming back as leader. I wasn't even forewarned that he came back in as leader. And I think this is another testimony to his leadership style, that I didn't speak to him once during the general election, even though I was deputy leader. He made all the decisions. He changed a number of our policies without discussion. And it was when all this started happening during the middle of the election that actually I did consider my position and I considered resigning. But people close to me said, Ben, stay the course. You'll never be forgiven if you resign in the middle of a general election. But I was privately banging the drum for democratization behind the scenes, writing to Richard Tice and Nigel and saying, I'll keep stum during the election. But as soon as we come out of the election, we must democratize the party. And Nigel, very cleverly, because he's a clever chap, came out on the 5th of July, the day after the election, and said he would democratize the party. But contrary to all the declarations he's made, actually he hasn't done it. He has retained control. And the branch network that they've set up is basically under the diktat of HQ. Branches are just instruments for HQ. There's no real grassroots autonomy. And as a result of that, and I think as a result also of Zia and Nigel wanting to really grip the party, they've basically gone around the country sacking all of the grassroots pretty much that was there when I was deputy leader. So it's a completely new set of people that have been parachuted in across the country. And it's essentially a completely different party to when I was with it.
Ben, you've sort of played into the Nigel Farage as a control freak and, as Rupert Lowe accused him, of being a messiah figure, and that's fair enough. But isn't the truth of the matter the following, that there is no reform without Nigel Farage, that there is no other movement on the right of the Conservatives than reform, and that equally he has to go softer because he's picked off all of the hard righties he can get at the last general election. And if he actually wants to be Prime Minister, he is going to have to moderate some of Reform's policies.
Yeah, so on those 3 points, you're absolutely right. Reform is Farage and Farage is reform. And that is my fundamental complaint. I don't think a party can be smaller than its leader. If you want to form a government to run the United Kingdom, which is his stated ambition, and why shouldn't it be, then you've got to have the ability to get really heavyweight people to come alongside you. It cannot be a one-man band. And Farage being reform and reform being Farage is not a signal that we should all just accept the position as it is. It's a warning that the position is not a healthy one. And that has to change if he wants to form a government, in my view. And then as far as him having to come to the centre ground because, there's nothing further on the right, actually, I'd say the Conservative Party now, in a number of respects, is further right than Nigel Farage. Jenrick is on record saying that he is in favour of mass deportation of illegal migrants. Nigel Farage isn't. Kemi Badenoch is in favour of, recognises that the rate of demographic change in the country is a serious concern to her, whereas Nigel Farage is on the record saying it's not a serious concern to him. And the other thing I would just say is that actually the electorate are not looking for a centrist, liberal kind of form of governance. What the electorate want is a form of governance, which they expressed in 2016 and when we voted to leave the EU, of a party and a government that's going to govern for our national interest. And if you look at the results of the 2024 election, they're really telling. The turnout was down from 67.5% in 2019 to 59% in 2024. 4 million plus people didn't vote. Basically, the kind of people who voted for Boris Johnson didn't come out because they were so despondent. And then if you add up the votes that Reform got and the Tories got, actually you're well north of the votes that Labour Party got. This country is essentially what you would call right wing. And pivoting to the centre, I think, is going to destroy reform, frankly.
Ben, do you think that there could be an opportunity for people like you, for Rupert Lowe, for others, putting forward the type of policies that you say would be very popular with the public? Is there space for another player? Some people have said, actually, you need to come together and show that Nigel Farage is wrong. You claim he's going centrist. Could you respond in that way?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that people like Rupert and me are not in politics because we want to climb the greasy pole of political advancement. We've done it after we've set up our own businesses, had a pretty successful private life. And we're in it because we genuinely are deeply concerned about the country. It's not even that I feel that I owe the country anything. Of course, I do owe the country something, but it's not a duty born out of gratitude that's brought me into politics. It's a fear that the country that I love so much is going down the tubes. And that fear grips Rupert, just like it grips me, and I think grips many people in this country. So we will not be leaving the political battlefield unless and until, even if it takes the rest of our lives, we've done our very, very best to restore the United Kingdom. And we will do whatever it takes in order to achieve that aim.
That sounds like a possible yes, that you could imagine with Rupert Lowe starting a new party to the right of where reform is.
Well, Nigel could easily neuter any new political threat to him by actually democratizing the party, embracing the great and good of our movement, if you like, and actually making policies which our movement want, which are the people who vote for reform want. But if he doesn't do that, then Kamal, you're absolutely right. He's opened up, a significant gap in the market, for want of a better description.
Ben, just finally, how well do you think Reform are going to do at the local elections?
It's going to be really interesting. I think the first thing to see is, how many candidates they're able to put forward, and then to see how they do in the by-election, which is obviously very important in Runcorn, and how many of their councillors get elected. But I can tell you, a lot of the grassroots that have been set aside by Reform, the grassroots with whom I worked when I was deputy leader, are now standing as independent candidates. Many of them are councillors, and they're challenging Reform. And everyone in the grassroots movement with which I'm connected is holding their head in their hands over Sarah Potchin being the candidate for Runcorn. I don't know if you followed her at all, but she was kicked out of the Conservative Party. She was then kicked out of something called Labour Independent, and she was kind of celebrating Syrian and Afghan refugees being settled in Cheshire East. So she's behaving in a way that is so anti-reform, if you're with me. And so it's just going to be interesting to see how these elections play out. It's a good question. I don't have an answer, but it'll be very interesting to see how they play out.
We certainly interesting to see how Sarah Potchin, if she does get the job, gets on with her other Reform counterparts. I mean, it perhaps solves to one extent Reform's woman problem, but I'm not sure how somebody at a refugees welcome and pro-transgender event is going to get on with Lee Anderson, Ben. But
no. Well, there you go. There you go. There are issues.
Ben Habib, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Well, golly, Camilla, that was interesting. I think that there's been rather more thinking about a party to the right of Reform than maybe I imagined when I asked that rather speculative question about Rupert Lowe and him coming together. I think actually that Nigel Farage is doing the right thing. To your question, he's got the people who are going to vote for Reform, although Ben Habib says they're at risk. But if you think about the IPSOS poll that they've done exclusively for us on the Daily Tea, one of the big issues for people who don't vote for him is that they think he is too divisive, he's too close to Donald Trump. And then there's the extra issue of the talent issue, which I think is where Ben Habib is absolutely right. If you are serious about running local councils and running for government, you have to have a serious set of policy proposals and a governance system and governance and a way of building policies that can't just go through one person. You simply cannot control an organisation through Nigel Farage.
I was thinking, though, it's a bit deluded, I think, by Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe to think that they're going to get a groundswell of support. They might be popular within the reform movement, but what, another party on the right? Doesn't seem to make much sense. I take your point about the divisive nature of Farage, and I do think that that Runcorn candidate, Sarah Pochin, is an odd choice. It's a very odd choice. The other thing as well, I think, that they need to consider is that actually the one main point that Habib has made that is the most damaging to Farage in many respects, it isn't really about him being a messiah or the row with Rupert Lowe. It is this suggestion he's gone soft. And Kamal, I spoke to Richard Tice about that earlier in the week when I was at College Green. And that is now a mounting criticism. You know, the expectation is that perhaps tonight some of the people protesting outside this rally won't be from the left, they'll be from the hard right, saying, why isn't reform honouring its manifesto commitments? That's problematic because I think Farage has been damaged by the reform row. He's been much more damaged, I think, by his stance on Ukraine and Russia. But if it's then suggested that, God forbid, Kamal, Farage has gone soft on immigration, maybe Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe should consider joining the Tories if they think that Jenrick is the real Farage here.
Well, as we said a couple of weeks ago, this week was going to be so important politically. Rachel Reeves and her spring statement, your analysis of that on Wednesday was absolutely superb. And then today, the launch of Reform's local election campaign will really set the scene for the rest of 2025.